cover a couple things today, focusing on some aspects of orchard fertility and then salinity management. An outline for the talk is first we're going to talk about just walnut nutrient uptake and availability, and then I'll go through how you would estimate your walnut nitrogen requirements for your fertility management plans, which I'm sure many of you know are due here coming up March 1st. I'm going to talk about soil, water, and tissue analyses and how you can use that to finalize and adjust your management plan throughout the year, and then also how that information is useful for understanding the impacts of salt. We'll talk about some of the other critical nutrients for management, and then a little bit on managing salts. So for nutrient management, most of California nitrogen and potassium management plans are based on nutrient removal by the crop. So that's going to make up the majority of how walnut trees utilize the nutrients is by exporting that through the crop. The rates and timings of other essential macro and micronutrients also consider characteristics of the soil, the cropping tissue, what your tissue analyses tell you how the trees are doing, and then observations that you make in the field. And so there are 14 essential elements for walnuts, and these all vary greatly in their concentration, but all are needed for particular functions in walnut. And the macronutrients make up about 5% of dried leaf tissue or plant material in walnut. And then those micronutrients, those essential, make up less than 1% of the total makeup. Nutrients are best applied when the tree can use it in amounts that won't leach past the root zone. And so in walnut, that uptake is mainly occurring when there's active growth, and that begins after leaf out. But the highest uptake levels are from the onset of shoot growth to the late stages of kernel fill. Some nutrients are needed for all stages of growth, while others have a short-term demand during the season. And then the nutrient mobility, both in the soil and the plant, influences the application rate, the timing, and the placement of nutrients. So when are nutrients needed? Okay, so I mentioned that some are needed at all stages of growth. So you've got your nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, phosphorus, magnesium, and calcium are all needed at all stages of growth, although only nitrogen and potassium are really known to become limiting in California orchards. So with the heavy crop, increases our demand for nitrogen and potassium. On the micronutrients, zinc and boron, they have a short seasonal demand, but still very critical. Zinc, we see a large uptake or large need for metabolic processes during spring growth, and then boron, particularly during flowering. So with regard to determining our nitrogen requirement, this is the pounds of nitrogen that are exported for every 1,000 pounds of crop for a variety of tree crops. And recently, the amount for walnut has been revised. And so I'll talk a little bit about where did this estimate come from. So previous research reported that 20 pounds of nitrogen were removed for 1,000 pounds of in-shell yield, but some more current multi-site, multi-year research in Chandler and Tulare varieties have found that both remove about 15 pounds of N per 1,000 pounds of in-shell yield. And this was determined based on the average of 6 sites over 2 years, and that study is still in progress. So just to show the Walnut nitrogen rate trials, that occurred at those different locations that I mentioned. We have one in the North Sacramento Valley, somewhere in the Linden area, and then in the Hanford area of the Southern San Joaquin Valley for both Chandler and Tulare. And then the numbers here are the pounds of N that were exported per ton of walnuts. And so looking at the grand mean of those over a period of these years, we have found that that's about 29 pounds per ton, or about 15 pounds of N removal per 1,000 pounds. Okay, but then what about the timing of the application? So that same study did a really detailed analysis of uptake through the growing season, looking at not only just the nuts and hulls, but also the tree leaf tissue, and then also woody tissue of the walnuts, and did some nice calculations of what uptake is from leaf out through nut development. And so these two graphs show the nitrogen accumulation in the fruit starting in May through September for both the Chandler and Tulare varieties. And so so the current recommendation is to apply about the first 26% after 70% leaf out in late May, in May, and then 21% by late May, beginning of June, and then 26% in late June or early July. Okay, so in terms of determining that nitrogen management plan, again, you want to think about what your expected yield is going to be, and you're going to multiply that by a factor of 15, so 15 pounds exported. And then these studies have found that about 20 pounds of leaf nitrogen is removed when the leaf senesce. So we are accounting for that in the calculation. We need to measure and account for all of your nitrogen inputs, so that includes your water. We can also look at the soil and other amendments, and then during the season we can adjust the management plan based on revisions in your yield estimate and predictive leaf sampling. Okay, so many of you have orchards in what are called the high vulnerability areas, and they need that nitrogen management certification. So if you're in these areas and you need more information, contact your local water coalition. Just for the Kings River Water Coalition, for those in Fresno and in the Kings area, you can find the templates that I'm going to show at that link. Okay, so this is an example of what your nutrient management plan would look at, and for an estimated crop of 6,000 pounds or 3 tons, the total nitrogen requirement is going to be 110, and here's the calculation for that here. So that would be your total nitrogen requirement, and then we're going to talk about filling in the rest of the table. It's important to look at soils, the other amendments you're using, and the water, so that you can accurately account for the additional nitrogen inputs from these. And then also, as I've tried to get to later in the talk, these analyses can also let us know about the chemical attributes associated with salinity and potentially identify the appropriate reclamations amendments. Soil sampling should be conducted regularly, maybe on an annual basis, and you want to take at least 3 to 10 subsamples from identified depths in each block, covering the rooting depth of the tree. So probably to about a depth of 5 feet would be considered the effective root zone for walnut, or the active irrigation zone. And then when sampling, you want to be aware of different soil types within your field, and you want to sample those separately and label them accordingly so that you can get a good representative idea of what's going on in different parts of your field. This might be an example of an analysis that you would get back. And then for that nutrient management plan, sorry, this example here is in nitrate, but I think most all labs have gone to the amount of, oh, I'm sorry, this is nitrate nitrogen in the plan. So that is what you will add as an input. So if you get your nitrate nitrogen values in the soil, you can make a conversion for what that means in terms of pounds per acre. And if we're looking at a sample with a 6-inch depth, and the report comes back with a range of nitrogen concentration, this is what those values would mean in terms of your pounds per acre, and the same for a 0 to 12-inch sample. So you can add that in, just making sure to note what the units are. So if the template's asking for pounds per acre, make sure that that's the conversion you have. So you have the soil N credits here. With water sampling, you should make sure to sample your water to figure out what the contribution is from either well or surface water. We recommend that this take place at several times throughout the year. With drought conditions, with fluctuating well levels, this can really impact the chemical composition of the water. So it's good to sample multiple times a year if possible. Make sure to run your well at least 30 minutes prior to sampling. And then here's an example of some of the nitrogen concentrations in water, and depending on the age of the trees and the amount of water applied, a higher parts per million of nitrogen in the water can make a significant contribution to your nitrogen inputs. So just highlighting that, if you're applying between 24 and 40 inches, that could make up half or almost your total nitrogen requirement for the season. So maybe in a drought year, if our estimated ET for a walnut crop might be 42 inches, but we're going to have a little less water than that, we might put what our anticipated crop irrigation is here. So I put 36 inches. So you would calculate your nitrogen and irrigation water based off of that estimate of what you will apply for the season. And so if we're going to apply 36 inches of water, the nitrogen in water would contribute about 50 pounds per acre. So if we're getting 70 pounds per acre from soil and water contributions, the difference from 110 would be a 40 pounds of fertilizer nitrogen. So 40 units of nitrogen for a nitrogen plan. Okay, but then we may need to modify that through the season. This concept of the forward tissue sampling has really taken on in pistachio and almond, and I do believe that this is available also for walnut, that if you do an early season tissue sampling, that they will do a forward estimate of what your nutrient analysis will be in July. So this may be a good tool to help you modify your nitrogen plan during the course of the season before you've made all of your applications. Otherwise, if you're just sampling in mid-July, it's kind of like just a good reference point for, okay, this was the nitrogen plan, and this is where the trees are at based on all of the applications, and it's good to note that for next season. See how that corresponds with your resulting yield. So you want to make sure to sample some detailed analysis by Catherine Jarvis Sheen up in Yolo County determined that the lowest level of variability is when you sample up to about 29 trees per acre. So And you want to make sure that those are about 90 feet apart. And you're going to take 6 terminal leaflets from non-fruiting well-exposed spurs. This sounds like a lot of samples, but this is what's recommended to give you the highest level of confidence in the nutrient analysis coming back. You want to make sure you submit those leaves for sampling very soon after, or if necessary, you can dry them at a low temperature if you can't get them to the lab right away. Okay, so these would be some of the deficiency and adequacy ranges, and for nitrogen, for that, for either the predicted July or the actual levels, we're looking for a range between 2.2 to 2.7% nitrogen. Again, you want to make sure to sample similar age trees, and if you're looking for if you're trying to diagnose deficiencies, you want to keep deficient looking samples separate from healthy looking leaves. And so this might help you troubleshoot in the orchard, troubleshoot problem areas to figure out, what the nature of deficiency is that you're having. So if you do that predictive May sampling, and it says that, in July, you're going to be at or greater than 2.7%. And if your estimated yield is a little bit lower than what you had predicted, then your nitrogen inputs could be reduced. If your sampling in May is, say, less than 2.2% nitrogen for July, and your yield is greater than predicted, you might need to increase your nitrogen inputs. But again, you can only make these adjustments if you're doing that forward prediction. If you're doing the sampling in July, it's just a good sort of grade sheet on what your management plan was like for the season. And then going forward, we'll be talking a bit more about the deficiency and adequacies for some of these other nutrients. Okay, so take-home messages about nitrogen management. These applications should be determined based on your historical yield performance, what your predictions are for the current season, tissue sampling, and then just overall canopy conditions. You need to include your nitrogen credits from water, soil, and other inputs. And then it's good to re-estimate and evaluate your nitrogen budget several times per season if possible. The longer you wait to adjust your fertility plan, the smaller the chances you have of fixing problems. And don't make a blanket nitrogen management plan for all of the blocks that you're managing. Treat each orchard separately. Okay, so potassium in walnut. Potassium is essential for the transport of sugars, formations of starches. Potassium regulates stomatal opening for transpiration for the trees. It promotes root growth and health, and it helps decrease the potential for disease infections. Potassium contributes to increases in nut size and nut quality. And the estimated annual walnut potassium requirement is about 30 pounds of dipotassium oxide per ton of crop. And then the higher application is, but then often higher applications are needed in deficient or potassium fixing soils, which are very common throughout the San Joaquin Valley. Okay, so about that potassium fixation. Okay, so oftentimes there's very high levels of potassium in soil, but that availability really varies dependent on the soil mineralogy, the parent material that the soil is derived from, the texture. If it's more sandy, it tends to have a lower cation exchange capacity for sites for binding potassium, as opposed to in a finer textured clay soil. There's going to be generally higher cation exchange capacity. pH is going to play a role in both scenarios. regardless of texture, higher pH, we tend to see a decline in availability. And so the amount of potassium in soil solution at any given time is probably only about 1 to 3% of in comparison to the exchangeable potassium for most soils. So there's a large potential for potassium fixation. And what else would I want to say about that? Okay, so then as the soils, whether it's weathering of the parent material or the addition of water and drying of the soil particles, the potassium is slowly released as other cations replace the potassium on those exchange sites. Okay, so to treat potassium deficiencies, so I mentioned that there's about 30 pounds exported per ton of crop annually, but a much higher application rate is generally needed to overcome that soil-induced deficiency. Some research that was done looking at comparisons of broadcast and banded applications found when looking at the increase in availability in soil, broadcast only improved the top 6 inches of soil, while banding increased it down to 2 foot. So that's pretty much the standard recommendation for soil amendments, is to band potassium sources down the tree row or down the margins of the alley, and that annual applications of at least 400 pounds showed improvement in soil potassium and tissue adequacy compared to a control. In some circumstances, it may take a couple years, depending on those soil conditions that I mentioned. If your soils have a high tendency to fix potassium, it may take several years of application before you start to see an improvement in those tissue levels. Okay, so micronutrients. Micronutrients, as I mentioned, are essential in small quantities for enzyme systems of the plants, photosynthesis and cell structure. They are generally immobile in plant tissues. And so when you have a deficiency in micronutrient, it's going to be very pronounced generally in young leaves. And so what's the cause of that in our growing areas? Well, a lot of our growing environments are high pH. They're oxidized calcareous soils that tend to precipitate out these micronutrients. So it's not uncommon to see in walnut in particular deficiencies in zinc and manganese, and sometimes iron. When we use nitrate-based fertilizers, this has a tendency to increase the pH in the root zone as the roots exude hydroxyls. So that tends to drive up the pH, and so this tends to reduce the availability of further reduce the availability of those micronutrients. And then with uptake mechanisms of the tree, competing elements can reduce uptake. So a common example of that would be in systems where we're using a lot of manures and compost. We can have higher elevated levels of phosphorus, and then phosphorus can complex with zinc, leading to deficiencies, making it unavailable for uptake. And then as with the fixation problems that I described with potassium, microbes can also be tightly fixed to silicate clays, making it unavailable to plants. Okay, so and now interpreting. So it's good to interpret the tissues to adjust your management plan. Make sure that when you're trying to diagnose deficiency symptoms, that you don't sample immediately after a foliar applications. Those foliar applied zinc, for example, readily binds to the cuticle of the leaves, And so they may give you a false number on what your levels are. It depending on what time of year you sample. So if you sample in say July when you're doing your nitrogen sampling, if that's when you're doing that, it may be late to make an impact on your zinc and boron levels for that year. Some fall applications may be helpful. And some studies in almond have shown that fall applications are almost as helpful as spring applications. But still, our understanding is that main window for uptake is during the spring, during that active shoot growth, and then during flowering for boron. Okay, so correcting zinc deficiencies with chelates. So chelates are organic compounds that react with micronutrients to increase their solubility, and what they do is they sort of form like a ring. So in this illustration here, if you have an iron cation, the EDTA is a compound of two molecules that effectively sort of like surrounds and protects this nutrient from precipitation. So in a high pH environment, the chelates protect the nutrient from precipitating out. So a soil, these tend to be very expensive, but if you're dealing with a severe deficiency, it may be helpful to try this. About a pound of zinc EDTA at 14%, about 4 to 5 feet from each trunk in a small trench may be helpful. This research shows that zinc EDTA, it can help translocate zinc to non-sprayed new tissue. So if you're applying as a foliar, zinc EDTA may help translocate zinc. Okay, so if applying zinc as a foliar, as I mentioned, post-bloom is going to be that best time during active shoot growth. Sorry, that should be 6 to 10 inches, not 6 to 10 feet. So apply post-bloom after 6 to 10 inches of shoot growth. And the general rate recommendations are about 2 pounds per acre of zinc sulfate in 100 gallons, or a higher rate with the chelated zinc for 4.5 pounds of 15% in 100 gallons per acre. And I think that some research has shown that the addition of surfactants really helps with uptake. You want to make sure to adjust your tank mixes to about a pH of 5, and then repeat this annually. Make sure not to apply any foliar sprays with nitrates. This can lead to phytotoxicity. Okay, so a little bit about salt damage. Walnuts are susceptible to problems with salt. And some research has shown that in general, for every 1 decisiemens per meter increase in soil salinity, so that's EC, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, for every increase over 1.5, you can expect up to a 20% reduction in growth and production potential. Visually in the orchard, you can see reduced shoot growth, reduced nut size. Trees seem to be more susceptible to sunburn and kernel shrivel, and elevated water stress, even when water is adequate. So if you're doing stem water potential readings, like Ken and Bruce were going over, sometimes even though well watered, the trees may indicate that they have a higher level of higher level of stress. So what causes this? Well, if we have drought conditions like we've been experiencing last year, hopefully not this year, but we need more rain. But if you have decreases in water availability, this tends to decrease the quality of water. The application of too much fertilizer and compost can also add salts to the soil. Regulated deficit irrigation is also shown to increase the accumulation of salts in the root zone. And then when we have low rainfall, to accomplish leaching. So, higher levels of evapotranspiration, higher than the amount of water that we're able to apply, we're going to get a concentration of salts in the root zone. And so it's good to stay on top of monitoring this in your orchards by looking at your soil, water, and tissue analyses. And so this is just a table of some of the basic parameters that can help you make that evaluation in terms of your water and your soil evaluation. EC, as I mentioned, so going for every one unit increase above 1.5 decisiemens per meter is we're going to start to see reductions in growth and yield potential. EC is an indicator of the overall salt concentration in the soil, and indicates and this will help us indicate the susceptibility to osmotic stress. As salt increases in the root zone, it becomes increasingly difficult for the tree to exclude toxic salts, and they may start to take them up. And if the salts start to accumulate in the xylem, in the woody tissue, we may start to see, that's when we visually might start to see necrotic burns on the margins of the leaves. And this is a condition known as specific ion toxicity. High pH, when we have elevated levels of pH, generally getting above 7.5, definitely greater than 8, that's when we start to see problems with nutrient availability, which was something that I mentioned with regard to the micronutrients. Nutrient availability is decreased with increasing pH. And then there can be saline sodic conditions in the soil and water that can induce infiltration problems. So you might start to see penetration problems on the orchard floor. Generally speaking, there's a lot of different factors looking into this, but if you have if your ratio of your sodium absorption ratio is 5 times greater than what your EC is, that may be indicative of what could be causing any infiltration problems. Bicarbonates can also be an issue. Elevated bicarbonates are also another driver of nutrient deficiencies, and can be responsible for clogging your irrigation systems. Looking at the level of bicarbonates in the soil is going to be key in determining if you need acid-based or calcium supplying soil reclamation amendments. And then it's important to have an idea of the overall EC throughout the root zone, so that effective root zone down to 5 feet, to be able to make some reclamation leaching calculations. In-season leaching maintenance, this is when we can apply a leaching fraction as a percentage of your applied water. So if you use ET for irrigation scheduling, it's going to be a percentage beyond the Walnut ET. The goal is to prevent the buildup of salts during the growing season by percolating water and salts below the root zone. But you're going to need careful management to prevent the oversaturation of soils. But when there's a water shortage, winter leaching is generally the recommended practice for managing salts. So saving that any extra water that you might have may be better to put on during the winter when evapotranspiration rates are low. Okay, so I mentioned about that amendment selection. So the level of calcium and carbonates in water and free lime in the soil is really going to dictate if it's best to use sulfur products or acid forming products So generally, if you have high levels of lime in your soil and high pH, you want to consider these. Calcium products are better when we have low levels of lime and carbonates. And so just a rule of thumb, when you get above about 2.5 mil equivalents per liter of bicarbonates in your water, those acid forming amendments are recommended. The reason being, if you add more calcium products, calcium tends to precipitate with bicarbonates, and this can lead to further clogging either in your irrigation system or even contribute to sealing at the soil surface. When your soil lime levels are greater than 1%, again, acid forming amendments. If they're less, if it's less than 1%, calcium forming amendments. And there are instances where you may want to use a combination of both, but that's a good just rule of thumb. And so choosing the best amendment generally requires balancing the cost against how quickly reclamation has to take place. So the estimated rates for acid amendments assumes that there's sufficient lime to react with the sulfuric acid. So just a different way of talking about what I just said is that, you want to make sure that there are actually high levels of calcium or lime in the soil to neutralize the sodium. So the main objective with applying these amendments, either acid-based or calcium-based, is that we're going to increase the proportion of calcium to temporarily raise the EC of the water. So these would be water applied amendments, and lower that SAR. So, if we have a ratio, a SAR to EC ratio that's greater than 5, we're going to raise that EC and decrease that ratio. In terms of application rates, these are calculated based on increasing those mill equivalents. So if we are increasing our calcium mill equivalents by a factor of 3 or less, that's going to be considered a low to moderate application. If we're going above that, those are what we consider higher applications. If we're applying gypsum, sulfur, anything that's precipitating the sodium, we need to make sure that after amending, we need to make sure to flush those salts from the root zone. If you don't, those salts are going to remain at the soil and precipitate as the soil dries. So a critical component of reclaiming the soil is to perform that leaching after the amendments. Okay, with winter reclamation, the depth of water that you need to lower the EC to 1.5 decisiemens per meter. So say your average root zone. So throughout that 5 foot wetting depth, your average root zone is 3 decisiemens per meter. You're going to need to apply at least 6 inches of water with 1.5 decisiemen per meter level concentration of water to lower that EC. And you want to start in early to late winter. First step is to fill your profile to field capacity, which generally, depending on your soil type, could be about 3 to 6 inches over a period of 3 to 4 days. You want to allow 2 to 4 days of drainage. We want to make sure not to saturate soils in this process, and then begin our leaching applications based on what we've calculated the need is. So we're going to begin with just applying 1 inch at a time over the course of the winter for a total of 6 to 12 inches. And again, that's going to be dependent on your soil texture, the starting level of salt concentration in the root zone, what your final salinity goal is, and the EC of your reclamation water. You want to make sure to keep your irrigation sets to less than 24 hours to avoid the risk of saturating the soil and creating anoxic conditions that can lead to infections like Phytophthora. And then just to build on what she was talking with regard to cover crops. Cover crops, improve infiltration. They protect your soil surface from droplets if you're using sprinkler irrigation and rain. So they protect the integrity of, they protect the integrity of the soil surface and reduce crust formation, reduce erosion and runoff. UC has some nice guides on selecting cover crops for walnut orchards, so you can look for those. And then just in summary on salt management, salt problems can develop in walnut orchards regardless of the water quality because of that high evapotranspiration in the summer. So even good quality water can lead to salt buildup. Salt creates osmotic stress, which can lead to increased susceptibility for ion toxicity, and high pH can induce nutrient deficiencies, and then salinity conditions can contribute to infiltration problems. In order to address this, we want to look at soil and water analyses to choose the correct type and rate of amendments, and calculate a leaching fraction. Amendments are needed to replace sodium with calcium to improve soil structure and infiltration. And then leaching must always follow amendment application. And it's best to accomplish this in a dormant season when ET rates are low. And then cover crops will help protect the soil surface and improve infiltration if that works for your operation. So with that, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mae. We have a couple of questions in Q&A. I think we have time to go through a couple of them, and let's see how we will go, and we'll later address if we need to. But the first one would be, what should the nutrient ratio look like on the tissue sample analysis?
The nutrient ratio of all the nutrients. Okay. Well, do they want to say like nutrient? I'm sorry, I don't know if I completely understand the question.
Yeah, what should the nutrient ratios look like on the tissue sample analysis? So I also don't know the context bit. So if Brian can clarify, if you're still, if you can speak about that. Or I think once probably the Brian will clarify a little bit. Brian will clarify a little bit on that, but we'll move on to the next one then. Why sample soils with a shovel when the trees continuously sample? What is the actually available to them? Leaf analysis tells us, right? Can you see the question there?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the leaf tissue is going to be the best indicator of how the trees are doing right now. And there is some ambiguity with interpreting those soil tests. But we just want to use all the information that we have available, and so we can take that information with a grain of salt. I think in terms of nutrient management for specific nutrients, you're right, like that may be a bit ambiguous, but then looking at things like specific to like pH, things with salt concerns, that's where managing the soil is going to be very important. But it's sort of like a goalpost, it's like we're looking at what, of course, the tree leaf nutrition is going to be the most important response indicator. But if we're applying a lot of, soil modifying amendments, we want to look at, things for a baseline, before we do that, after we do that, over time, maybe particularly with things like potassium, looking at what those exchangeable and soil solution levels are over time, to see what the impact is of the different rates that we're applying. So I think there is value in looking at the soil analyses.
Okay. Thank you. Is Brian